Welcome, everybody. Most of you know me, but for those who don't, my name is Sylvana Szydzik. I am an archaeologist and I work as a conservation project officer here at PAHSMA. And as we all know, PAHSMA are responsible for the management of 3 of the World Heritage listed serial property, the Australian convict sites, so Port Arthur Coal Mines Historic Site down here on Tarracanna, Tasman Peninsula, and of course the Cascades Female Factory in Nipaluna, Hobart. As we share knowledge and research today about the colonial occupation of Tarracanna, Tasman Peninsula, I'd also like to recognise the enduring knowledge and cultural practices embedded for all time within Tasmanian Aboriginal custodianship of country. I acknowledge the Padarama Punjena people on whose traditional lands we gather today, and I pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past and present. So today I'm going to explore a little bit about how archaeological research has evolved at Port Arthur and how it continues to shape our understanding, our preservation and the experience of the site today. And I'm going to start with my story. So I came to Port Arthur first as a baby archaeologist 15 years ago for one of the, what turns out to be the last Port Arthur Summer Archaeology program. And Tassie just got under my skin, and working in a collaborative and curiosity-led environment changed my life completely. And elements of my story go even further back, and in the 1830s, my 3 times great-grandfather, William Tuckerman, spent some time at Port Arthur too, sometimes in iron, sometimes in solitary confinement, and later on in Hobart, where he started a family, including his granddaughter, Alma Tuckerman, who was my great-grandmother. So for me, this has added an additional layer of interest and investment in the research and the interpretation of the convict story. And I've been working here for nearly 9 years now, and I love the diversity of my job, as well as all of the different people that I get to work alongside. So what is archaeology? Archaeology is the study of people and their stuff from the past. So the things that they made, they used, that they left behind. If people didn't leave written records, how do we know what they ate, what they wore, and what they did in their everyday life? Archaeology. And this is particularly relevant here at Port Arthur, where there is so much written documentation about the administration of the institution and those in the system, but so little evidence of their actual lived experience. And historical archaeology is the study of past societies that have written records by combining archaeological methods with historical documentation to better understand people's lives, their behaviour and their culture. And the material that is identified through historical archaeology forms part of a shared heritage, often carrying multiple meanings shaped by traditions, memories and personal or collective experiences. While archaeological research aims for objective interpretations of past human behaviour, its findings can challenge established narratives or conversely affirm lost or marginalised perspectives. And for some, these interpretations may disrupt long-held beliefs, whereas for others, they offer validation or empowerment through the recovery of overlooked histories. Beyond academic or informational value, archaeological materials often hold aesthetic, emotional or sensory significance. So people may respond to the rarity, texture, beauty, sentimental associations of objects and places, regardless of their historical or scientific importance. So thus, archaeology not only reconstructs the past, but it also engages with the diverse ways that people connect with history in the present. And the most important thing to remember in archaeology is where you find something is just as important as what it is. And we call this context. And for me, context is key. So like all of those layers in this rainbow cake, the layer of soil in which an object is found can reveal a lot about how and when it got there. And this is a really great example from the penitentiary laundry excavation. So these objects were found during the excavation of the ablutions and the exercise yards behind the penitentiary, which we know from historical records was built in 1856, and it burnt down in the bushfires in the late 1890s. So in this image, the archaeologist has carefully excavated away the soil to reveal these objects, which, as you can see, are carefully shaped out of broken ceramic. And they're sitting in their original context, which is, if you can see close enough, it's a fine grey silt with charcoal, lots of grass roots, which tells us that they were close to the surface. The objects are positioned all together, which tells us that they were deposited all together at the same time. And they are located sitting on top of the bricks, which we know from historic records were laid in 1856. So putting all of these clues together, we can read as we're excavating. So we have a cache of objects that are located in the upper layers of the soil, which was charcoaly, above bricks that we know were laid in 1856. So we can infer from all of these details that they were potentially, stored in a bag, or they were stashed somewhere altogether, hidden in part of the building, or maybe under the floor, which collapsed or burnt down in the bushfires. And if somebody was walking past and saw, these poking out of the ground and then took it away, it would then change the story and therefore our understanding of what it was and where it was. Once an object is taken away from its context, you can't go back. So as archaeologists, we take a lot of care to record important details about objects that we find before we take it out of the ground and then remove that layer of soil. So what does an archaeologist at PAHSMA do? So my day-to-day role is generally divided into three main jobs. Excavation and monitoring of any ground disturbance that might need to be done. So this includes trenching for underground cabling, new drains, old drains, post holes, any new buildings, making sure that we don't disturb what we know is under the ground, and also making sure that we don't disturb anything we didn't know was under the ground. And if we do find something, that it's recorded fully, like this drain behind the asylum there. And that's you, Jodie Green. Thank you, that. I also help to research, I also help coordinate research into our collections, and this often comes in the form of partnerships with universities and researchers, such as the collaborative research excavation that you can see on the left there, and material analysis. And in this photo, Julie is using a Fourier transfer infrared spectroscopy, and this was both with the University of New England. I'm also involved in the maintenance and the care for archaeological collections that we hold here on site. So these are all of our records and all of our objects, of which there are a lot, and I will go into this a little bit more later on. So for now, we're going to turn to a quick run through of the development of archaeology at Port Arthur. And this began in 1977 with a pivotal excavation led by University of Sydney's PhD student Maureen Byrne, which highlighted the site's rich archaeological potential. Now, this work demonstrated the extent and the complexity of Port Arthur's archaeological resource and laid the foundation for a sustainable and a research-driven approach to managing convict heritage. Also in 1977 was the use of infrared aerial photography within the Port Arthur landscape. So these were the really early days of the development of remote sensing techniques in the field of archaeology, which allows people to detect and map buried structures and features without disturbing the ground. And it provides a method of large-scale analysis of landscapes, revealing patterns and relationships that might not always be visible through excavation alone, or even just kind of looking at the ground. So while aerial photography and to a lesser degree infrared film had been used in other countries for some years previously, this is the kind of the first time that it marks the first substantive use of this method for site identification and planning here at Port Arthur. And in fact, these 1977 runs, which you can see there at the bottom of the screen, were so useful that they were not superseded until about 2006 by a new light run. The 1970s saw archaeology at Port Arthur Historic Site evolve from a purely academic endeavour to a central component of site management, conservation and public interpretation, and in this positioned it at the forefront of the development of historical archaeology in Australia. So over time, the site has mirrored and often led national standards and trends, serving as a training ground for generations of archaeologists and introducing innovative methodologies such as remote sensing and integrated conservation practices. From 1979 to 1986, under the management of the National Parks and Wildlife Service, the Port Arthur Conservation and Development Project, or PACP as we call it around the office, expanded archaeological efforts, integrating them with the conservation and redevelopment plans. Key investigations included work at the Civil Officers Row, at Garden Point, the Clerk of Works House, or Lith End as it's otherwise called. And these projects not only preserved important historical data, but also marked a shift towards a collaborative and interdisciplinary kind of approach to conservation. The Commandant's House excavation, which you can see pictured on this slide, ran from 1982 to 1984 and was especially transformative during this period. It was led by Martin Davies, and it introduced a layered interpretive model that embraced the site's full historical continuum rather than just focusing on one single era. And this approach revolutionised Australian historic site presentation and introduced a layered approach to interpretation, making it possible to tell a story of change and evolution rather than just the restoration to a single historical time period. This was also one of the first archaeological summer programs carried out by staff and assisted by an army of archaeological volunteers. Working with the architects and the builders, Martin Davies was able to develop an innovative approach to recording the archaeological evidence and integrating it with historical and other sources of information about the place. The resultant structural evolution recording system was widely published and put Port Arthur at the forefront of buildings archaeology internationally. Through these developments, Port Arthur advanced methodological standards and helped to define modern historical archaeology in Australia, especially with the publication of the Port Arthur Archaeological Procedures Manual, which was a core guiding document for many decades to come. So there was to be a 4-year hiatus between the end of the PACP period and the employment of another staff archaeologist. And in the meantime, management of the site passed to the newly formed Port Arthur Historic Site Management Authority. This was established in 1987. In recognition of the archaeological significance of the site and of the importance of the work that had been done so far, the PAHSMA Act was established to make a special provision for the continuance of archaeology at the site. And this was the first piece of archaeologically kind of proactive legislation in Australia. The overarching vision of the Port Arthur Historic Site Authority is to conserve, manage and promote the Port Arthur Historic Site as a cultural tourism places of international significance, a juggling act of some difficulty. This vision reflects the authority's statutory responsibilities, which balance the preservation of key 19th century convict sites, the promotion of public understanding of their historical and archaeological value, and their development as major tourist destinations. The key legislation that helps guide heritage management at our sites are the Port Arthur Historic Site Management Act in 1987, as well as the Historic Cultural Heritage Act 2000, which is a Tasmanian document, and the Aboriginal Heritage Act of 1975. And these are complemented by adherence to the principles of the Burra Charter, which is Australia's guiding document for cultural heritage conservation. So the Burra Charter, it's all about doing as much as possible, as little as possible, but as much as necessary. And the idea basically is that places of cultural significance should be actively conserved, but with special regard for their physical fabric, which often holds much of their historical meaning. So the Burra Charter also mandates that sites should not be left vulnerable or unmanaged, that threats must be identified and mitigated proactively. And furthermore, conservation must be interdisciplinary, drawing on a wide range of expertise, and should be done informed by thorough research and analysis before any decisions are made. The 2010 World Heritage listing of the Australian convict sites marked a really significant turning point for PAHSMA's operations in how it approached archaeology. So the Australian convict sites are, as Nikki said, a collection of 11 historic locations across Australia, and these represent the global story of forced migration and the development of penal colonies by the British Empire during the 18th and 19th centuries. So this recognition highlighted the global significance of the sites and led PAHSMA to shift from volunteer-based excavation programs to more sophisticated research-driven archaeological programs. So this change aligned with evolving university courses that increasingly provided students with practical archaeological experience, and also the rise of a professional consulting archaeology industry, making PAHSMA's original training model a lot less necessary. This transition also prompted a reconsideration of archaeological efforts at the site. So while earlier projects had generated a large amount of data, the focus had largely been on the process of excavation rather than the strategic value and the broader dissemination of the findings. So much of the resulting information remained in limited access technical reports, contributing little to public knowledge or academic discourse. And PAHSMA at this stage also recognised the need to move from just collecting data to generating meaningful knowledge and interpretations from our extensive collections. PAHSMA committed to fostering collaborative relationships with academic institutions to focus on a more analysis and interpretation. And so this included supporting postgraduate research, so including multiple honours theses, PhD projects, as well as hosting a variety of field schools that emphasises non-invasive techniques. And the goal was to engage not just with academic audiences, but also with the public by making archaeology much more accessible, relevant, and also engaging through storytelling and exhibitions. In parallel to these shifts, PAHSMA also invested in modernising its archaeological practices and managing its collections much more effectively. And so this included the development of a variety of excavation methods, as we'll talk about soon in the Penitentiary Precinct Stabilisation Project, adopting technologies such as LiDAR, laser scanning, photogrammetry, X-ray imaging, and a focus on the dissemination of research findings through media, through public talks, conferences, journal articles, books, and as well as digitisation and reorganisation of archival material produced by the previous generations of archaeologists. So now that we have a bit of an understanding of how archaeology has developed at PAHSMA and the crucial role that it plays in understanding our sites, I'm going to turn to 3 case studies that show some of the new tools that we've been using to help us in our work over the last little while. So these case studies do have crossovers in with the next session of my talk, which is going to be around challenges in heritage management. But I wanted to first highlight some of the key discoveries and the excavation techniques and the advancements to demonstrate their role in uncovering the lives of those who lived and worked here before turning back into some more broader heritage management considerations. The first of which is the Penitentiary Precinct Stabilisation Project. So this project highlights some technological advancements that we've been using in archaeology at PAHSMA, as well as some challenges that we're facing at our site, such as storytelling of spaces to help visitors understand these places, and also adaptation to climate change. So in 2011, a major storm event sped up planning for a stabilisation project on the penitentiary. And the swell was so big that it caused chaos along the foreshore and inundated the penitentiary. The goal of the Penitentiary Stabilisation Project was twofold: stabilisation of the heritage features and to better understand the stories of convict life, especially those aspects that had gone so long underrepresented. This precinct, it really presents 3 key aspects of convict life and the opportunity to explore those for our visitors as well. So the first is incarceration and reform. So this is evident in the design and the structure of the penitentiary, which includes cells, dormitories, a chapel, the school, and a library. The second is industry and production, so reflecting the use of convict labour in the workshops, in the foundries, saw pits, the tanneries, anything to kind of sustain the settlement and generate an income. And the third element, which we loosely call recreation, but what we really mean is non-work time, those small moments of time that can be given over to conversation and smoking and kind of, an individual's needs. And so to tell these stories, we relied on two main sources: historical documentation and archaeology. And while documentary records offer valuable insights, they're not always reliable or complete. For example, some of the building plans for the penitentiaries were never realised, and sometimes essential features like the library are missed from the actual architectural drawings. So these records mostly represent the perspectives of officials and administrators and not the actual convicts themselves. So thus, archaeology became essential, offering physical evidence that could either support or challenge the historical accounts and enrich understandings of the lived experiences of those who inhabited the site. So this project, the PEN project, embraced a proactive archaeological strategy, which in practice looked like intense research excavations over many, many years, incorporating the inside of the penitentiary, the muster yard, the ablutions yard, the laundry, and then later the workshops. So rather than being constrained by construction needs, as is often the case in archaeology, the team defined really clear research questions and targeted areas with high archaeological potential. And this approach allowed for a deeper, much more meaningful understanding, focusing not just on the preservation of the site, but on generating new knowledge about the building and the people who lived and worked in it. And by prioritising research over mitigating damage, the project succeeded in uncovering both the physical realities of the penitentiary and also the human stories embedded within its ruins. And the image on this slide demonstrates this perfectly. The highlighted area is the location of the concrete footings. So you can see just how much of the bigger picture we would have missed if we were to just dig along where the footings were to be located. One interesting story that came out of this excavation was the issue of inconsistent work quality of convict labour, which would have been a persistent issue for site overseers. So this is the ablutions yard behind the penitentiary. And during the excavation, a series of sumps designed to aid drainage beneath the spoon drains were discovered in both the east and the west yards. And while constructed identically, the eastern yard sumps functioned reasonably well, but those in the west failed completely. And this was due to geological differences. So the east yard sumps were set in a really porous redeposited clay, allowing water to freely move through, whereas those in the west yard were built into impermeable solid clay. And so this discovery raised broader questions about quality control at Port Arthur and possibly across other convict sites as well. So the convicts fulfilled their orders by constructing the brick and the sumps as they were instructed, and yet the final results did not achieve the intended function. So this illustrates a really common pattern where tasks were carried out to specification, but not necessarily to effectiveness. The fact that the drainage issue in the West Yard was never corrected suggests that either the problem was never really fully understood at the time, or there was limited motivation or means to actually address it, highlighting a disconnect between administrative oversight and those more practical outcomes. The excavation of the penitentiary precinct was the most comprehensive of its kind for a convict era site in Australia. And given the size and the complexity of the site, which featured a range of surface and subsurface features, including gravel areas, structural remains, and really intricate subfloor stratigraphy, there was a need to come up with a really robust and accurate method that suited both the horizontal and the vertical elements of what we were looking at. So the flat area helped with recording, but the variable nature of the archaeological deposits meant that we needed an approach that could deal with really detailed documentation across many different levels. So the decision was made early on to incorporate photogrammetry into the recording process. And this marked a really significant, departure from more traditional methods like hand-drawn plans, aiming instead to enhance both the accuracy and the versatility of site documentation. So photogrammetry is essentially a process of taking hundreds of images, as you can see by the blue squares on the image on the left, and using specialist software, you stitch them all together. And so the resulting images and the 3D models are then georeferenced, and they also provide an incredibly accurate spatial data, essential for archaeological analysis and illustration. And this was particularly useful for a single context recording system that we use. So if you think back to the rainbow cake, each colour is assigned a different number. And so this methodological shift significantly expanded the potential for both research but also public interpretation of the site. Another advancement in this project was the use of X-ray technology to study iron objects at the site, especially nails. Knowing we were likely to encounter a large amount of architectural metal, such as nails and screws and bolts and the like, in this particular excavation, we decided to utilise X-ray for all ferrous objects that were recovered. And by no means a new approach in archaeology, radiography not only enables the identification of otherwise unidentified objects, but very importantly, it provides a record of basic data across the whole ferrous or iron assemblage. And this is not recoverable by any other realistic means. So beyond identification, we think that this basic data is the real gem of this X-ray process. So the measurement of each object, its form, manufacture process, its quality, and we can now start to look at answering questions of the production and the use of these everyday objects, nails, tools, screws, punches, buckles, buttons, by the convict population at Port Arthur. So while nails might seem mundane, they actually hold a surprising amount of historical information. And X-rays have helped us identify nail types, manufacturing methods, offering a much clearer picture of the colonial supply chain, as well as potential on-site construction practices. And this whole process was really quite fun. It was like a mystery board game or a weird and messy advent calendar. So first, each object was secured to an A3 sized board. Most of the metal was small, so we averaged 50 to 80 objects, nails, buttons, small amorphous blobs and unidentified metal objects, or UMOs in our current line of work. And these were then X-rayed with various exposure parameters as defined by the density of each object. So this ranged from 60 to 70 kilovolts. Digital images were then sent to our artefact specialists to be catalogued. And at the moment, we are buying time for the artefacts by placing them into a nitrogen environment until decisions can be made about their future. And when you think about it, perhaps it's easier and even more appropriate to store 56 digital X-ray images rather than 56 boards in nitrogen. When you consider that essentially you're storing the same thing, you are storing data about something. So of this one particular assemblage, 3,176 ferrous objects were X-rayed, and identity was established for over 95% of these. And this was a massive win for us. The second case study that I'm going to turn to is our collections. And one of the major challenges that we're facing is how to incorporate digital technology not only to manage, but to make sense of an enormous and ever-growing collection of heritage material. So we have over 700 archaeological projects that have been carried out across Port Arthur, the coal mines, as well as Cascades Female Factory. And this has produced a staggering volume of records, so maps, drawings, field notes, reports, photos, and of course, thousands upon thousands of artefacts. And the sheer scale of it is overwhelming. And it has become quite apparent that an occupational hazard of being an archaeologist is being a professional hoarder, with tendencies to keep everything, even when it's really not clear just how much or what kind of material will come in. And we want to make sure we're doing the right thing, but we also have an underlying ethical and professional obligation to responsibly care for the data and the collections that have been generated through archaeological research. So this keep it all approach stems from a sense of professional best practice, but it brings with it a real dilemma. If we are going to keep everything, we also need to store and conserve and manage it properly, and that comes at a price. A key initiative that we have kicked off here at Port Arthur has been the development of a comprehensive digital archive that consolidates decades of archaeological work into an accessible and an electronic format. And so this includes cataloguing artefacts, scanning field records, and creating a system that researchers can actually use. And this archive reflects the unique significance of Port Arthur collections and will be an essential resource, hopefully, for both research and public engagement. And collaboration remains key to get the most out of this. While PAHSMA is not a research institution, as such, it has effectively facilitated research by fostering long-term partnerships with universities, specialists, and local stakeholders as well. So this collaborative model ensures that archaeology remains relevant within the broader goals of site management, as well as connected, international best practice standards as well. And the third case study highlights the use of LiDAR and in the understanding and potential interpretation of an overgrown landscape with often quite subtle heritage features. So Point Pua used to be a boys' prison, and it's a large and quite a complex site, and today is quite difficult for most visitors to really understand what's going on and its historical importance. So the site was abandoned in 1849, at which time many of the buildings were removed. So currently there are no buildings left or limited kind of structural evidence, and thick vegetation hides many of the features. And there also aren't very many visitor facilities out there either. So people usually only see like one small section of it. LiDAR, which is light detection and ranging, kind of like laser scanning, is used to essentially strip away the vegetation in a digital model, revealing the landscape underneath it. And LiDAR has proven to be a game changer for heritage sites. It's cheaper and more accurate than traditional surveying methods. It can see through vegetation, and it even detects really small features that might be otherwise missed. Plus, it helps track environmental changes over time. And it works really well with tools like GPS or global positioning systems and geographic information systems as well. And most importantly, it opens up these hidden places to the public in a clear and engaging way. On top of that, using remote sensing like LiDAR is great for sustainable archaeology. So digging sites up can destroy valuable evidence forever, even if it is done really carefully. So there's been a big push towards using less invasive tools like geophysical remote sensing to learn more without causing that irreversible damage. And you can see this image, how well you can see the scars on the landscape from the roads, from building platforms and trenches out at Point Pua from the boys' prison. A few years ago, John Stevenson at Heritage Tasmania came up with a really creative way to bring the site to life using new technology. So using the LiDAR, John added 3D models of buildings based on old architectural drawings and then mapped them really accurately into place using historic maps. And so the result is a virtual version of Point Pua that people can explore from pretty much anywhere, helping them understand the site's layout and the significance in ways that really wouldn't be possible on foot when you're actually out in the site. So now we're going to zoom back out a little bit and look at some of the challenges in heritage management at PAHSMA. And these include things like climate change, visitor impact, and ethical considerations. The Coal Mines Historic Site presents a case study in the complexities of managing a convict-era landscape that is both overgrown and thus challenging to manage, as well as interpret for visitors, and it's also under threat from climate change and coastal erosion. So these images show the change in the foreshore due to coastal erosion. These are images of the coal spoil along the foreshore. And one of the key challenges out at the coal mines is really balancing preservation with ongoing environmental pressures, especially where natural forces and vegetation obscures, damages, and often even erases really important historical features. Again, LiDAR, light detection and rating, has proven to be a really invaluable tool in helping us understand these challenges. So the coal mines, this technology not only refined existing survey data, but it also led to the discovery of over 60 previously unrecorded features, including building platforms, drainage systems, and as you can see on the screen there, really subtle cultivation patterns like this rig and furrow systems. The location of these cultivated fields on the sandy and infertile soils of the hill remind us that just the massive effort that went into making these places in some way self-sustaining. In addition, we've also started using repeated laser scanning to monitor the foreshore, and it's been really helpful picking up recording the movement of material over time. LiDAR offers really valuable insights into how landscapes can also be strategically understood for settlement administration. So for today, for those of us who are familiar with the site, you go out there and trees obscure sightlines that were once really crucial for surveillance system, as demonstrated in this 1841 painting on the right. So these sightlines can actually be analysed through LiDAR to reconstruct view sheds, revealing areas of control or lack thereof. And here we have the extent of regrowth at the coal mines, and in the centre image, the LiDAR generated view sheds across the main site. And to the right, the reconstruction view line of the 1839 inclined plane. Unfortunately, I don't have a comparison of what it does look like today, but it's very overgrown. And so by linking this analysis to historical records, particularly the convict data, a detailed understanding of both the physical environment and the daily experiences of convict and administrators can be gained, enhancing the historical understanding and representation of the settlement. However, understanding the landscape is only half the battle. The coal mines, especially in its coastal zone, faces threat from coastal erosion. And traditional survey methods have struggled to capture changes caused by wind, by rain, and by tidal forces. And so here, repeated laser scanning combined with high precision photogrammetry have become essential tools, allowing us to monitor how the terrain changes over time. And at the foreshore, where key features such as the coal screening dump, which I showed you in the earlier images, the jetty remains, which you can see on the right, tramways and unknown sandstone footings, the image on the left, they're being actively reshaped by natural forces, and these technologies provide a really great way to map the degradation over time with accuracy. Despite these advanced tools, physical intervention is often not always feasible. And heritage management at sites like Port Arthur and the coal mines is often constrained by the immovable and the fragile nature of the historic fabric. So engineering solutions, while sometimes necessary, can also be quite costly and then risk compromising the site's historical integrity, which we are charged to protect. So in places where intervention is impractical, regular scanning can become a form of preservation through documentation, so enabling the site's evolving conditions to be recorded and interpreted even as elements are lost. So in this way, technology not only enhances our ability to understand these landscapes, but it also shapes how we care for them. Managing visitor impact on archaeological material at our sites is a very complex challenge. So as one of Tasmania's most visited heritage destinations, we must balance public access with the preservation of fragile archaeological remains. So foot traffic environmental exposure caused by increased visitation and unintentional disturbances from tourism infrastructure all pose risks to in situ material. High visitor numbers can compact soil, they can disturb stratigraphy and accelerate erosion, particularly in areas where archaeological features lie close to the surface or they've already kind of partially been exposed. Well-meaning visitors to our sites often hand in objects that they have seen and collected during their visit. Doing this, as we talked about earlier, often disturbs their context, and removing the object from the valuable information about where it was found and compromises the integrity of the site for future research and interpretation. One of the key issues is the cumulative wear on vulnerable surfaces, especially in zones where original or fragile ruins are often accessible. So even well-meaning visitors can unintentionally contribute to the degradation of these materials by straying from designated paths or touching exposed masonry. And interpretation and accessibility infrastructure such as paths and signs and seating can sometimes inadvertently contribute to these problems by encouraging movement across sensitive areas or concentrating pressure in zones with limited carrying capacity. So to mitigate these impacts, PAHSMA use a mix of physical protection, visitor education, and ongoing monitoring. So physical measures include the use of raised walkways, such as in this image, you can see a Wayne measuring for a raised walkway over the foundations identified during the 2016 archaeological excavations. Also, we use barriers and signage to guide foot traffic away from particularly sensitive zones. Interpretation design is very carefully planned to tell the site's stories without compromising its fabric. And regular condition assessments and archaeological monitoring ensure that any signs of damage or change are identified really early, allowing for responsive management strategies. And ultimately, managing visitor impact at Port Arthur is about finding the right balance. So ensuring that the stories of the past remain accessible and meaningful, while protecting the physical evidence that underpins them for the future generations. Ethical considerations are key to management of sites like Port Arthur and the coal mines and Cascades female factory, where the landscape bears the weight of difficult histories of punishment, trauma, forced labour, colonial expansion, demonstrated by the broken leg iron on the left of this slide that we found recently during the excavation of the workshops. Interpreting these stories respectfully and accurately is both a professional responsibility and a moral obligation. The site's global recognition as part of the Australian Convict Sites World Heritage Property places us under international scrutiny. And, and that kind of demands that narratives are inclusive and evidence-based and mindful of the human suffering that has shaped its past. One of the key challenges lies in representing the harsh realities of the convict system without sensationalizing or romanticizing it. Port Arthur has long been associated with its identity as a penal hell, but modern interpretation strives to move beyond such stereotypes. And so this means acknowledging incarceration and forced labour and psychological control, while also making room for individual experiences, so stories of resilience or adaptation and sometimes defiance, as demonstrated in this little buggy character, which is the central image on the slide. And this was carved into a child's writing slate recovered from the commissariat officer's house in 2007. So archaeology plays a critical role here, grounding these stories in material evidence that both supports and challenges the historical record. The goal is not to soften the truth, but present it with care and context, allowing visitors to reflect on the enduring human impact of systemic punishment. Equally important is engagement with the Tasmanian Aboriginal communities, whose histories intersect with the convict-era landscape in complex ways, as shown in the image on the right, which is of the original foreshore on which a silkrete flake was found below the land reclamation layers. Although Port Arthur was primarily a convict settlement, it exists within a broader colonial frontier where dispossession and violence towards Aboriginal people were systemic. Ethical archaeological practice today requires consultation and collaboration and recognition of these overlapping histories. So where archaeological work uncovers traces of Aboriginal presence or impact, either directly or through the broader colonial landscape, these findings must be approached with cultural sensitivity and respect for community protocols. So ethical considerations in heritage extend beyond the excavation trench or the exhibition space. It's about fostering trust and respecting cultural sovereignty and ensuring that the narratives presented are not only historically accurate, but also inclusive of the many peoples affected by the legacies of colonialism. As we have seen today, archaeology is not just solely about excavation. Excavation is often the culmination of extensive research and planning and is undertaken only when other sources of evidence are insufficient or have been exhausted. At Port Arthur, we engage with the whole range of documentary evidence, archives and oral histories, and the landscape itself to understand the site's history. So this comprehensive approach allows for a more nuanced interpretation of the past, ensuring that a wide range of stories associated with the site are acknowledged and preserved. Archaeology at Port Arthur informs how the site is conserved and interpreted. The insights gained from excavations and landscape analysis directly shape management decisions, so helping determine what elements of the site are preserved and how they're presented to the public. Understanding how people lived and worked in these spaces, whether convicts, military personnel, or free settlers, enables us to make informed decisions that respect the complexity of the site's history and ensure that its relevance for future generations. The future of archaeology at Port Arthur lies in its capacity to uncover new stories while embracing contemporary values, technology, and more inclusive practices. As research continues, it will bring to light underrepresented aspects of life across the site, offering insights into its social, cultural, and environmental histories. So central to the future is the integration of digital tools such as LiDAR, GIS, 3D modelling, and combined with a commitment to inclusive storytelling. And these methods will not only enhance our understanding of the past, but will also inform future conservation and interpretation strategies. And we have reached the end of my talk, and I just would like to acknowledge to all of those amazing people who have come before us, on whose research and ideas and commitment we continue to build on.